Okay, so the microphone is on. Ladies and gentlemen, the most important remaining item on our agenda is to make sure you get to the reception and the cocktail on time. So we'd like to start with this, in effect, this follow-on panel on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. My name is Jonathan Freed. I have some passing familiarity with the subject, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this topic. To introduce our eminent participants in this panel discussion. We're going to try and keep it a bit conversational, but effectively, I think in anticipation of whatever is released and announced in the fall, as Paul has put it, we're going to drill down a bit and take a deeper look at some of the dimensions and some of the aspects, and we have great wisdom, I think, collectively to share among us. I could take the entire period allocated to this panel to introduce our three discussants, but you have their full bios on the website, so I won't do that other than to say I've long been an admirer of each of them and an avid reader and listener to their contributions on China, on the Indo-Pacific, and on related international trade, economic, and security subjects. So we're going to start with a brief set of reflections from each of the three to set the stage. I'm going to pose what I hope will be challenging but interesting questions in successive rounds to each of them, and we'll still try and leave time for discussion as well as questions and answers from you in the audience. So let me begin with Professor Paul Evans from UBC. You've heard him ask probing questions earlier in the day. Paul, would you like to set the stage?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for everyone being here after the feature speech. We are a chance for us to delve into some things that Paul Topol opened up and that a lot of us have been reflecting on now for many, many months. What might be an Indo-Pacific strategy, and no one reflecting on those more deeply than the gentleman beside me, Jonathan Freed, who had been a seminal force as some of this thing got going. And I want to thank IPD and the Asia-Pacific Foundation for this particular gathering. I think at a time of really some momentous movements in the world, our ecosystem of discussion locations is somewhat skewed, and this gives us a chance to bring together people who have thought deeply about Asia-Pacific for a long while, and a new institute that is thinking through the contemporary era in security relations. So thank you, and I think we're all lucky to be part of this discussion. I think regarding Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't know in this part of the world, when does fall begin? This is a kind of interesting challenge. And what I'm going to say is it's too early for me to predict what's going to be in it. And also it's too late for me to do any prescription that is going to make it in it. So these are some outside comments. But I wanted to, for my couple of opening remarks, talk about the moment. I don't think this is business as usual time for all of the reasons we've heard about today and in our lives. Some big forces are in play. COVID, Cold War, climate change issues, etc. Being a university professor is a challenging business right now because of the momentous number of things that are happening in addition to war in Ukraine and then changes in the part of the world that we're here to talk about today on the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific as it's now being framed, at least by some. And it's also a momentous moment here in Canada on our discussion on these matters. The politicization around ideas, the feverish attitudes of the Canadian public, particularly on a country that wasn't named by Paul Topol, but that I will name, which is China, that this is it's a time of a pretty high emotion. And it's a high emotion that is, I think, going to be with us for a while. And I wanted to say, I don't know in your minds what you think the most important event is of the last month. When I ask my students this, many say the 20th Party Congress and some of the things we discussed earlier this morning. From my, and I was prepared to start from that angle, in that you can't have an Indo-Pacific strategy without having a China framework, a China dimension, a China angle that is absolutely integral to it. Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific are a lot bigger than China, but because of the presence of China and the antipathy that has created and opportunities that it has created, you can't. I admired Paul Topol's ability to speak for 40 minutes without mentioning a specific country by name, any country by name. It was really a special thing. But everyone in this room knows that the very idea of Indo-Pacific is fundamentally created by a perception of a rising China and a changing power balance. That different variants on it, but China has got to be part of the picture. And for me, the event in the last few weeks that has been most important is actually one that happened in the United States. And that's the semiconductor restrictions that have been put in place against China, not just Chinese companies, that are multidimensional, that are deep-seated. And I say it because as we're talking about the roots of conflict, cooperation, the kind of landscape of international relations, I kind of have it in my mind that it's the competition, the technology war over foundational technologies that is going to be fundamental to the balance of power in Asia, not necessarily today or tomorrow, but within 5 years or 10 years. It's that fourth industrial revolution that is occurring, and who is going to control it, or at least who is going to benefit from it in the best way. And it strikes me that what we've had with the United States and the CHIPS Act earlier, but particularly around semiconductors, this opens a whole new phase. And this is not about competing with China. This is about containing China's economic development in a crucial sector. We've seen it in information technology, now it's in the artificial intelligence semiconductor world. But this is a step towards comprehensive economic containment of China. And we don't need to be sensationalist about it. It's a recognition that in a competition for the high value-added sectors of the next economy, the United States is not going to be outcompeted. It is not going to be lose a position of supremacy. And I'd frame it as a new generation of techno-nationalism. And this, we have seen it developing in steps, but this one is not a step, it's a leap bigger. It's not an effort to limit China in these areas, but to strangle Chinese capabilities in this area. And my hunch is, and this is a prediction, I think it's going to be extending into other sectors as well. Artificial intelligence is the beginning. Biotech, pharmacy, biopharmacy, agricultural economics, a whole range of fields that are in the purview of a similar kind of logic. And that's a story for the United States, and one we'll be watching very, very closely, because it fundamentally challenges the idea of a rule-based international order, as at least I understood it 6 months ago. This is an alteration on a pattern of globalization. We talk about decoupling. We talk about friendshoring as part of a discussion that's coming up around this. But this is a step, a big step, in the direction of the bifurcation of a global economy. The question I posed to Professor Wong earlier, Dr. Wong earlier this morning, about is this the end of internationalization and globalization as we know it. Well, I think it's moving us into a new stage of it, to say the least. And if we then bring it, what does this mean for an Indo-Pacific strategy for Canada? It may well be the case that we do not have a fundamental consensus on what kind of economy we think Canada can support and be part of going forward. And that the recent speeches by Ms. Freeland, by Minister Champagne, Ms. Freeland on not just the democracies, autocracies side of the issue, which we heard about a few minutes ago, but in terms of a securitization and a recognition that the current world system, global system, isn't working. It was a search for an alternative to it, and that's where friendshoring, working with those you know best, is a logical and reasonable suggestion. Well, I'm going to say, Jonathan, just one more thing, and that is that I think we're seeing some of the ingredients of what this is going to look like coming forward in the world that I come from, and that's the university world and university-based research. And the new restrictions that are coming into place as built in our national foundations, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, Research, INSERC, and is soon to be adopted by our other agencies. And the dimension of this is that as a scientist, as you look at the kind of projects and cooperation you can have with unnamed countries, country agnostic, but China being a real case within that in those rules, a researcher has to know whether their work is going to have impact on military, dual-use kinds of situations. Not new. The second is that researchers are going to need to know whether the work they're doing can have an impact on Canada's commercial advantages in a sector. But the third one that we started to hear about this morning is that research has to be evaluated from the perspective of what impact it will have on human rights and Canadian social values. And Canada is not alone in using some of these. A variety of American institutions are already doing that. But if you see what that means, if you start using those kinds of questions to ask about research, mainly in the science and technology areas, but now in bio and a number of others, it opens it up at least the possibility of a dramatic set of new rules that will infringe maybe on academic freedom, maybe on open science. It's worth arguing about that. But it does signal something very new in a global economy and how we're positioning in it.
Thank you for provocatively starting us off. We're still going to try and keep these openings short enough that I can still challenge you folks, as well as from the audience. So,
absolutely expected.
So, Stéphanie, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to the organizers to come and speak. Is this working? No?
Yep.
Yeah, here we go. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk to you today in such good company as well. So I'm delighted to also have the opportunity to do this for the first time in person in a very long time and to reconnect with colleagues and friends. So thank you for that. So the notion that Canada needs to get its act together when it comes to the region, however it's defined, right? So whether it's defined in Southeast Asian or Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific terms, is not a new consideration, right? It's been there for quite a while. And I was struck last night because I was working on finalizing a paper that actually reviews a collection of different recommendations that the expert community in Canada with regional networks and international collaborations have been putting forward for a number of years, right, for the past decade or so. And I was struck by actually, despite the realization that we are currently in a moment that is quite specific, that has new dimensions that we need to grapple with. actually a lot of the solutions and recommendations that have been made for the past decade or so when it comes to Canada's engagement of the region are actually still quite relevant. And this was quite striking to me. And of course, I don't want to rehash them today, but I want to start things off by actually questioning a common thread that underpins these recommendations, and actually the overwhelming majority of commentaries that we've seen about Canada's engagement in the region, which is that we need to bridge the gap between rhetoric on the one hand and practice on the other, right? That we need to walk the talk, or that we need to move from words to deeds. And I want to question this because it seems to be that the assumption is that, we have the talk figured out already, right? Or that, we even, according to some, that we even talk a good game when it comes to the Asia-Pacific or the world, for that matter. And I want to question this because, it seems that the idea is that once, if we can figure out a way to bridge the talk to actual commitments substantiated with, clear objectives and obviously appropriate resources to fund these substantial commitments, then we would finally be recognized as the Pacific or Indo-Pacific nation that we know we are, or that we are meant to be, right? But I want to put forward a different argument today, and that's going to be kind of a thread that I use throughout my comments, is that I really think that our difficulty in turning rhetoric into concrete action when it comes to figuring out, how to play the Indo-Pacific game actually stems from the fact that we haven't found a clear voice when it comes to the Asia-Pacific yet. We don't have a coherent understanding of who Canada is or wants to be as an Indo-Pacific nation, grounded in clear answers to fundamental questions. What are our objectives? What principles should guide the pursuit of these objectives? Who we are in relation to others, like-minded or otherwise? And where do we want to make a difference, and how, right? And I do believe, if I want to be cautiously optimistic, that the Indo-Pacific strategy that we all expect and been expecting for a long time can actually help us begin to develop that coherent, convincing, and effective narrative that we lack about who Canada is as an Indo-Pacific aspiring nation. So I think, like most of you, I expect to be somewhat disappointed by the results of that exercise, but I do believe that at least developing that Indo-Pacific strategy is an opportunity for us to work out some of the fundamentals, to begin to outline certain answers to these difficult questions. And I choose to be somewhat hopeful that this is what we will begin to see, and I see some elements of that as well in the comments that were shared with us previously. So what I'm hoping for is that this Indo-Pacific strategy can serve as an opportunity for Canada to do two things. So first of all, take a substantial leap forward in figuring out the story it wants to tell about itself as a regional actor, and then tell it convincingly, right? Because the problem is not rhetoric in itself, it's empty rhetoric. It's rhetoric that doesn't mean anything, or that we cannot kind of understand as it connects with our objectives and vision for the region. And I think we also need to get the story right in both words and tone, and that the narratives needs to be anchored in a clear set of guiding principles that make sense for Canada in its engagement for the region. And in that sense, and I'm happy to elaborate further on that, I think these principles hopefully should align with regional perspectives and Southeast Asian and ASEAN perspectives on regional order in particular. I think this is where Canada needs to go when it comes to devising a coherent narrative for itself in the region, and one that will have an impact in terms of securing the objectives for regional order and possibly its international ramifications. Thank you.
Stéphanie, thank you. Jeff? I should add, by the way, I introduced Paul. Stéphanie Martel, eminent professor at Queen's University, a fellow and more here with the Asia-Pacific Foundation. in an advisory capacity as well. But it's Dr. Reeves who holds the fort as the Vice President and Research Director at the Foundation. So you're the cleanup in this opening round of remarks.
Great. Yeah, I'm not sure there's much left to say. I'm the third person on the third panel of the first day, and a lot of the ideas I think that are worth discussing have already been out there. So I'm just going to move really quickly through some of my own thinking, and indeed just kind of approach this through a thought exercise to try to sort of organize some of the ideas that have been out there, because I think that's helpful, especially as we move on to discussion of Canada's approach to Asia, in identifying some of the major themes, some of the major challenges, and perhaps starting to question and answer some of the important issues that I think Stéphanie brought up. So when I think about how Canada should approach the region, I usually think about it in terms of two forces, kind of the pull factor from the region, right? What are the demands coming from the Asia-Pacific around Canadian engagement? And then what are the push factors, right? And by push factors, I mean, what are the Canadian foreign and security policies that we're developing here in Ottawa for engagement in the Asia-Pacific? Now, in terms of pull factors in Asia, I think we've talked about this already. There's clear demand for greater Canadian supply of natural resources, services, trade, and for foreign direct investment, particularly in areas related to infrastructure development, where there's clearly a huge demand across the region. We have panels scheduled later today to dive into both areas more deeply, but I'll just preface those discussions by saying the demand for Canadian LNG has grown in the region's advanced economies, whether that's Japan, South Korea, or China. Even in Southeast Asia, where demands for energy security, particularly clean energy sources, are increasing. Now, Canadian minerals such as iron ore and copper, agri-foods such as wheat and pork, and timber products such as wood pulp and sawdwood are similarly in great demand throughout the region. Asia remains largely supportive of services trade with Canada in the form of personal travel to the region, which pre-pandemic was growing, as well as services related to education and transportation. The region also is very open to Canadian investments, particularly in areas related to sustainable growth and infrastructure. Now, that said, the vast majority of Canadian investment that went into Asia over the past 5 years, Asia broadly defined here, went into Australia and China as a secondary destination, not the countries in Southeast Asia where the demand is so strong. Now, on the push factor, Canada seeks to build, obviously, influence and within the region to advance its trade and its investment relations, to support sustainable and inclusive growth, to help with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise development, all areas that overlap with the region's pull factors, right? And where Canada can make significant progress relatively early and through a small amount of effort. Indeed, really the only thing I think standing in the way of greater Canadian economic footprint in the region seems, at least to me, to include the lack of supply from Canada around natural resources, the unfamiliarity with opportunities and conditions outside of its more targeted economies, more traditional economies, and a low threshold for risk on the side of Canadian investors. So aside from these easy win push factors, though, Canada has also political and diplomatic aims in the region, including, as Paul mentioned, support for the rules-based order, cooperation with the non-geographic West around an Indo-Pacific ideal, support for democracies throughout the region, strengthening relations with the in-between countries, dealing with Chinese coercion, and supporting human rights and good governance, among other worthwhile goals. But here's kind of where it gets a bit tricky and where Canadian strategy may struggle a bit and where it's necessary, I think, to speak frankly. Now, while Asia is open to engagement with Canada on its own terms, that pull factor, right? There's decidedly less support for the non-economic components of the push factor, particularly among the states that aren't part of what we now are increasingly calling the global West, right? Indeed, on the idea of a rules-based order, for instance, one finds little interest among the states in South and Southeast Asia, and of course in China, for the concept. Indeed, if you raise the concept of a rules-based order within the region, nearly anyone in Asia who works on security or strategy outside of Canberra or Tokyo will likely respond that there is no such thing as a rules-based order. There's international law. The focus that we repeatedly hear in Western literature about Asian rules-based order doesn't really resonate among the Asian states themselves, outside of perhaps the very narrow security concerns like territorial disputes, where international law doesn't provide clear guidance or clear answers. Now, on Western state alignment in Asia, similarly, one finds sentiments ranging from cynicism to outright opposition across the region. Now, while Western states are, of course, interested in working with Western states, working with Canada, they are by no means looking for Western state leadership, and indeed sometimes see Western state involvement in Asia as unwanted interference. This is, I think, particularly true as the global West coalesces around an idea of Indo-Pacific strategies and concepts, many of which are drafted in places like Amsterdam and Brussels and Canberra and London and Paris, Tokyo and Washington, and in new institutions like the Quad and AUKUS, which we've talked about, sometimes with very little regard to regional demand and regional states' preferences, or even the idea of regional states' agency, right? Indeed, it's worth mentioning here that few outside of the global West or the non-geographic West use the term Indo-Pacific in Asia, at least not in any way other than to pay lip service to American military dominance, or in a sort of negative sense, such as the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, which, from my perspective, is fundamentally a rejection of the idea in all but name. The preferred term within the region remains the Asia-Pacific, or simply Asia. Now, on democratic promotion and strengthening, one finds even less alignment between Canada's hope for the region and regional developments. Across Asia, democracy is not only in decline, but public support for democracy is decreasing, particularly as regional models of governance from Singapore to China become more appealing for their ability to provide stability and public goods, right? Don't forget that it was China that provided most of Asia with vaccines during the height of the global pandemic, while the global West hoarded supplies and prevented technology transfers and overseas production. Those sort of things don't honestly go unnoticed, and they are not easily forgotten. On the in-between countries, and here I'm using Deputy Prime Minister Freeland's language to describe non-democratic countries of strategic significance, one does certainly find willingness to engage with Canada, but really only on the term that support their own national interests, as one might expect, right? If Canada pursues pull relationships with these in-betweeners, it will face, I think, warm reception. If it attempts to bring them alongside in a democracies versus autocracies view of the world that the Deputy Prime Minister's speech suggested Canada might adopt, it almost certainly will find a more chilly reception. Indeed, good evidence of this is almost the complete absence within Asian states for being classified or treated as a like-minded state, as they largely differ from the global West on issues ranging from the war in Ukraine to China's global war to China's global role to Western views of maritime security, which we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow morning. Indeed, I guess it's worth noting here that the term like-minded states has its roots in Cold War discourse, where it was used to describe democratic state alignment against communism, kind of a usage that seems to be coming full circle. One finds little support for the idea of Chinese coercion within Asia, outside, again, very narrow areas of national interest, such as national territorial disputes in the South or East China Sea. We simply don't see much evidence across the global South or Asia's developing states that China is viewed solely as a threat. Indeed, there's an interesting body of data that has just come out from Cambridge University's Center for the Future of Democracy that shows that more of 70% of the global South's 6.8 billion people have a positive view of China and Russia. Now, similarly, and I'll wrap up, Jonathan, we can see in regional discourse and data that developing states take a different view of human rights in the region, seeing economic opportunity and stable governance as more important indicators than human rights around religious and ethnic issues in some instances. Now, none of what I've said is to criticize Canada's foreign policy values and priorities. In fact, I believe Canada should be applauded for the values-based approach it takes to foreign affairs in the region. What it does suggest, however, is a significant gap between where the region wants from Canada, those pull factors, and what Canada believes it can bring to achieve in the region, those push factors. Indeed, not only are these priorities out of tune with one another, but they can actually be oppositional, with the push factor in particular creating conditions that could ultimately undermine that pull factor, particularly if those push factors becomes the driving thrust behind Canada's approach to the region. So what should Canada do? Can I say it, or should I save it for later, Jonathan?
Well, you're each very successful in carrying on long enough to avoid questions. So,
Can the first question be what Canada can do?
no, that's the last one.
All right.
All right, look, we're going to turn this series of questions into a lightning round to keep it short and crisp so we can cover some ground. And it's all in the spirit of moving from rhetoric to action. So let's start where each of the three of you, one way or another, highlighted what Paul chose as a consummate diplomat to skate around a bit, and that's the West and China. Paul described it as a very fraught moment, if not an inflection point for East-West relations. You and other speakers have highlighted Chrystia Freeland's speech to Brookings that talked about friendshoring, that talked about regrouping. At the same time as Xi Jinping has been, shall I say, coronated for his third, if not lifetime term. At the same time, you know, with the two Michaels behind us, or the three M's, as somebody put it, with Madame Meng, Canada's relations with China at some level is returning to some normalcy on various fronts in a fairly pragmatic kind of way, such as the restoration of agricultural trade. So, and even Chrystia Freeland in her speech said in a later paragraph, but of course we should continue to trade with China, but not in areas where our economic and national security are put at risk with a potential serious adversary. So all of that adds up at this pivotal moment to ask each of you very quickly, how should we think about Canada-China relations in this context? They, to some extent, are an indispensable partner, but to some extent, and supplier, and so on, and to some extent, a genuine adversary in various fields. So what does that mean in practical terms as part of an operational strategy for Canada's engagement with China? So we're going to go maybe to Stéphanie to start.
I'll try. I'm not sure. I think you're answering your own question, or at least in the extent that I can contribute to answering that question. I think, you know, I agree. We're definitely at an inflection or a tipping point when it comes to our relationship with China. And I think, you know, the problem we're facing is that there is still, to some degree, an ambivalence that I think reflects the complexity of the situation that we find ourselves in, which is, you know, and I don't know that this situation is necessarily all that new, in the sense that the fact that world politics see a coexistence between elements of competition and elements of cooperation is nothing new. I think what we see as changing is that it's always been kind of a dynamic equilibrium, but now the equilibrium is actually tipping towards the more confrontational aspects. I think when it comes to an aspiring middle power like Canada, let's put it that way, we do have an interest in kind of offering, you know, a position of cooler head kind of spirit that I see less and less being possible or developed at the moment. And that worries me, because I do think that in the case of Canada, there is a clear interest in avoiding, or at least making sure that we can play down as much as is possible with the current moment, these kind of zero-sum, Manichaean, dichotomizing, binary thinking of world politics. And unfortunately, I see less and less space for that happening, including in my own position as a an expert on the region. And this is worrisome. So I don't know that I have very specific answers in terms of what that could mean operationally, Jonathan, but I do share at least your diagnostic.
Jeff?
I don't know if I agree with the pretext that relations are returning to normal. And I think in particular... Okay, when we talk about this moment in particular, there's just such a wide range of obstacles between, I think, Canada-China relations, certainly at the strategic level. And I think they're just going to, unfortunately, get more pronounced in the coming months and perhaps years, just because of some structural issues that Canada doesn't have a lot of control over. The elections in the United States, for example, legislation that's moving through American Congress around Taiwan, for instance. The growing support of the Global West for Taiwan, which is a net positive for that self-governing economy, but it's a challenge in terms of the status quo, certainly, and one that is going to introduce a degree of strategic instability into the Asia-Pacific region that Canada will ultimately have to internalize in its approach to China. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the new empowerment of NATO that is also including a somewhat kind of normative expansion into the Asia-Pacific region, where we're seeing defense ministers from Japan and South Korea and Australia visiting as observers, and that's certainly a paradigm shift in terms of what NATO's ultimate purpose was as a defense alliance focused on Asia. So a lot of these things are going to introduce, I think, fundamental tensions within Canada-China relations that will make it very difficult to maintain I think, a balanced strategic relationship in particular. I think trade and investment clearly continue. The commercial ties are strong. They provide a bit of a ballast against a complete disintegration of relations, and I think in that sense, any effort that could be made to shore those up should be taken. If we can focus on the people-to-people level and engage in education exchanges, maintain research collaboration when we can, allow for participation of Chinese academics in forums like this, make sure that that's something that we accept and we see value in. Those are the things that are going to keep the ship from completely capsizing. But if we do talk about a moment in time, I deeply worry about the trajectory that not just Canada-China relations are on, but basically and again, I'll use Global West, and I'm using this in line with, I think Gideon Rachman coined the term a couple weeks ago, but non-geographic West, so Western states that are aligned ideologically, not geographically, which includes Japan as part of that paradigm.
Paul?
Let me use a different metaphor. We're in a dark decade in the Canada-China relationship, that there, I don't think, are many positive signs of where we're going to be able to go at the strategic level with China. But the metaphor I'd use is not an ocean, but is a frozen lake. And that we're going to be dealing with a period of pretty hard ice on the top. But beneath that layer of ice, there's a lot of things that are going to continue. And economic, the people-to-people, the kinds of things many of us in this room do. But here's the caveat. Until recently, one could believe that we could try to work with China on some elements of reinforcing the global economic institutions and some of the UN and other organizations with China. I think that's going to be real tough right now, and particularly selling it to a Canadian public, but on the substance of it. So if I project it out, Jonathan, in one sentence, it would be that we are going to be able to work with China, are going to have to do selective decoupling. There's going to have to be certain sectors that we are not going to be able to work with China on deeply, not just in the narrow national defense sense, but that broader sense of security. There are some things that will be easier if we can agree we're not going to work with them on, just as they already have that with us. But here's the kicker. It's when you actually start defining those sectors with precision. If we're going to friendshore, who do we friend with? What are our expectations of what we would get from our friends in those contexts? that we don't already. So I kind of hope, Jonathan, that you would answer this question because you have been living on the edge of this matter of how we put China and in Canada on the same page in a constructive way in light of a pretty dark sky.
Well, my one quick observation, as I said, is that Deputy Prime Minister Freeland herself said trade should continue. Maybe some sectors will be off limits. This government hasn't repeated what former Minister Garneau said, and encapsulated in 4 Cs, but the 4 Cs may capture this mix that you've each referred to. And he talked about cooperating where there is common cause. Take climate change as an example. China, for its own well-being and polluting all of its cities to record levels, maybe behind New Delhi, but close, has an interest in reducing pollution significantly. We're deeply committed, as Mr. Topol said, to an active climate change agenda. There should be opportunity, whether through clean technology or through COP27 or otherwise, to work together. We're going to compete, and we should compete, but on a fair and level playing field on trade. That's the second C. We should and will continue to confront them, no doubt, on the Uyghurs, on human rights violations, on values and interests where there are fundamental differences. But at the end of the day, the 4th C, if all of you seem to accept that the world is not completely decoupling, is we're going to have to coexist. There has to be minimum rules of the game in sharing the planet without going to war. And that, to me, is pragmatism and the middle ground writ large. Paul can say whether that's anything close to an accurate reflection of current government thinking. Certainly as an outside observer, that's my one additional thought. So let me move on. And I'm going to take the liberty of correcting just about everybody who's talked so far on the Indo-Pacific, because if you read up, the Indo-Pacific as a conceptual construct was actually coined by India long ago to understand the scope of security, and particularly maritime security and the challenges facing the region. But of course, more recently, with the advent of Belt and Road, Mr. Modi changing what had been a look east policy from India to acting east and reaching into Southeast Asia, the active trade agenda and the noodle bowl or spaghetti bowl that's unfolded in the regions with partners from Europe, partners from the Americas, all seeking to deepen economic ties, and so on. Now it's become a bit of a shorthand to encompass just about all the elements that Paul referred to: defense and security, trade and economic, development agendas. And depending on whose strategy you read among all the countries that Mr. Topol outlined, some of those strategies reach as far into East Africa, some reach into Central Asia. So we're not going to be best of friends all the time with each and every one of Paul's 42 countries. So my question to each of you, for a Made in Canada strategy in light of the interests, values, and priorities Paul and each of you has identified, how amidst that heterogeneous mix of countries, from the second and third richest in the world to some of the poorest, in that, how do we scope out who are our best countries of interest and countries of most concern in the region among that long list? And how do we align that, not just everyone says, be careful to be alongside or paralleling the United States, but with the EU and its member states and other significant players, both beyond and within the region. So, put it most crassly, what's your country list? Jeff?
I kind of flipped the question a little bit. Rather than look at the Indo-Pacific and then try to reverse engineer a list of countries that I'd like to have relationships under an Indo-Pacific strategy, I'd first look at the partnerships that I hope to establish at the country level, and then see if a strategy was necessary in order to foster relationships with those states to begin with. And that's where my main gripe with the Indo-Pacific comes from, is because I feel like, on the one hand, we have I think all of the descriptions of the activities and the intentions and the partners, Southeast Asia being, the kind of the center of gravity, I think, for all of that. It makes so much sense in terms of Canada's approach, its priorities, its engagement. But then it's difficult to then flip that over and say, how does that fit into an Indo-Pacific strategy that includes the European Union or includes aspects of the Indo-Pacific as seen through the global Britain approach to the region? How does one look at a Indo-Pacific that includes the Indian Ocean? Because certainly there's no African version of the Indo-Pacific, right? There's no place to plug that in. There's no, again, demand from Africa to have an Indo-Pacific approach. That's just something that we've determined is going to be part of the strategy going forward. I think the only thing I would say as well, and again, to answer your question specifically, it's Southeast Asia, and I think China, ultimately, and those two things go hand in hand. You have to get China right to get Southeast Asia right. You have to get Southeast Asia right to get China right. But I think the real concern I have about Indo-Pacific is, Jonathan, I take your point that it's an old concept, but I worked at United States Pacific Command when this idea was bounced around by Admiral Harry Harris at the time at a think tank, and I remember the discussion around, do we use Indo-Pacific instead of Pacific or Asia-Pacific? The logic inherent, at least from the U.S. perspective, was this is a China containment strategy. And in fact, literally in a room with senior officials said, this is about putting warheads on foreheads, right? That was the language that was being used around Indo-Pacific strategy, and that was the determination at that time to switch U.S. PACOM to U.S. Indo-PACOM. The idea that you could expand the AOR to include the Indian Ocean, thereby bringing America's military assets and naval assets from the Indian Ocean through the Straits of Malacca into the South China Sea, and you could expand your parameter for thinking about threat perceptions towards China to include those different areas. So I know that it's an old concept, but I also worry that America is so predominant with its usage that it's a little bit hard to get away from.
Let's go to Paul next, and Stéphanie will have the last word.
I'm on Jeff's side in this debate. The concept of Indo-Pacific, when it reached its maximum force, was the American conception of a way to respond to a rising China. But there's certain advantages for Paul Topol and his colleagues putting an Indo-Pacific strategy together right now, is because no one knows exactly what Indo-Pacific means. We've got a set of definitions that range from what I would call an American sense, which we have a pretty clear, over to the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, which, boy, Alina, it sure looks to me like it's a concept of Asia-Pacific as we tried to build it 25 years ago, but which unfortunately, as Paul accurately stated, is no longer the tenor of the neighborhood. Within that, if I'm right that Indo-Pacific can cover a variety of possible strategic frames, three places I would look that we can learn most from and that I think we should study as deeply as we can. The first is Japan, because I think it was Japan that was the first to break away from the narrow American conception and to build inclusiveness into the process. You don't like China, but you don't exclude China. You push back against China. You're 4 Cs, Jonathan. The second place is Australia, partly because they're so hard to get along with and so lovable and right and sophisticated in the way they have thought through some of these issues. They live at a level of sophistication in this discussion that, and inner conflict in what to do I like. But the third one is to echo what Jeff has said. I think we reinvent ASEAN centrality. Southeast Asians' ways of trying to navigate through a great power rivalry. Having said that, it's traitorous to use some of the Southeast Asian concepts in Canada. If we talk about non-alignment, if we talk about multi-alignment, if we talk about forms of neutrality, this is very hard for any Canadian policymaker to be able to sign on to when we're in a sense of a conflict with authoritarians, with aggressive powers we don't like. When we do have strong democratic values, where most of the Southeast Asian countries don't in the same way. So learn their foreign policy orientation so far as we can, nimble diplomacy, but with limits.
So I guess the two, my colleagues, stole my thunder a little bit, but I'll try to kind of situate myself in what remains. Although I share a lot of what's been said, I do think I have a slightly different position on the Indo-Pacific, because I was the first, being quite skeptical when of all the buzz around it, at least, knowing that it's been, an old concept. I do think ultimately that ASEAN has also come to realize, and perhaps Canada did to some extent, that the Indo-Pacific construct of the region is not going away. So they're reluctant about that. They would have preferred it otherwise, probably, but it's not going away. So therefore, what can they do, and what can we do to some extent, is to push for a version of the Indo-Pacific, because again, as Paul mentioned, and I do believe, Jeff, you probably agree on this, the Indo-Pacific is a floating signifier. There are many different ways to define it, so we might as well push for the kind of way that we think, it would be a more productive way to define it. And I think here, again, we can draw from ASEAN's book to some extent. So that would mean, obviously, pulling some of the principles that guide this ASEAN outlook and that align with both our interests and values. And that means, making it as inclusive as we can without compromising on our values. And I think this is possible. I think, the idea that we can identify, I don't like this kind of in-between framing, because again, I fully agree with Jeff here that we kind of downplay the agency of Southeast Asian states in particular, and we have done so, and by we, I mean the Western, actors in particular, playing down the agency and the fact that these actors are not just in between, or are not just in a kind of proxy position to be exploited and kind of pushed on one side or the other. But they have understandings of regional order that they now frame as an Indo-Pacific outlook that are rooted in the importance of cooperative security, the fact that we can draw out these areas of potential collaboration despite having some confrontational elements at the intersection of security and development. And I think this aligns very well with our sustainable goal, inclusive growth priorities, but there is a security element to that needs to be kind of put at the center of an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think being more recognizing and respecting the fact that these countries do not that a lot of these countries do not fit neatly in these democratic versus authoritarian categories would lead us to look into how Vietnam, how Indonesia, how Singapore have been developing their own kind of understandings of regional order, whether that's Indo-Pacific or otherwise. And finally, just to kind of push away a little bit from what Paul was saying earlier in terms of the Indo-Pacific being basically from the ASEAN perspective, being the Asia-Pacific in a new bottle. I would say that there has been still some movement toward kind of an in-between position of the Indo-Pacific as being neither, from the ASEAN perspective, as being neither too broad, right? Because there were, issues, institutional fatigue around these broad kind of ARF or even APEC definitions of the Asia-Pacific as being too broad to come up with anything of substance, or being difficult to identify a lowest common denominator. And at the same time, avoiding these kind of too narrow understandings of the Indo-Pacific with clear strategic overtones, with a very narrow definition of who our friends are. And in between lies this kind of ASEAN plus 8 formula, right? So, okay, I came in late in these discussions today, but I haven't heard, in previous sessions a lot being said about the East Asia Summit, right? Which is the formula that ASEAN came up with to kind of redefine this in-between space between the too broad and too narrow when it comes to defining the region. And I think this aligns very well to reconnect with what Paul was saying with ASEAN's understanding of the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, I'm going to impose on you to just take another minute or two and then still questions or comments from the audience, building on what you just said. In effect, despite the unifying notion of an Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, we're living in an era of increasing what you might call mini-lateralism, whether it's friend-shoring or ad hoc agreements that certain countries only will get together and deal with critical minerals, or DEPA, which was referred to earlier, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, CTPPP versus RCEP, Quad, AUKUS, IPEF. So we're sort of doomed to a fragmented map of minilateralism. There is no unifying single architecture. Canada's always been known as a joiner. You got an organization or a forum, we want to be there. But it sounds like some selectivity and prioritization may be needed in that regard. I'll ask you whether you have any comments on that. But to finish up, because it was the main demand from the audience to Paul and a promise from Paul in return, if you have a multi-year approach and it's robust and it's government-wide, if not country-wide, over a medium term, in light of what we said at the start of the discussion about this being a pivotal time now, if you were the Minister of Finance and the Foreign Minister and the Trade Minister and the Development Minister, who have it in their mandate to do something, what would be your immediate priorities at the front end of this multi-year strategy and priority? So 2 questions in one, and you get 1 minute each to answer. And in the meantime, anybody who wants to come to the mic, please do. So we'll go back to the original order here.
Damn it. Where to start in this process? First, because I don't think there is going to be a possible Canadian consensus at multiple levels because of the fractured nature of our country and multiple perspectives. We can find some rallying points around wanting to increase our economic interactions. Paul Topol did a fine job of talking in the abstract about several different things that are as close to homogenizing as we can find. But on balance, it is to remember, I think, that our strategic role in the region as compared to our commercial and our people-to-people kinds of things, which are important. Let's push. Let's make sure immigration works better. Let's make sure visas work better. A whole agenda there. That's important. But from a strategic perspective, means to hold hands with our American friends, but not go any further on a first date. That the idea that we are going to support America in its efforts to maintain its dominance in an era where we know the balance of power is shifting. That the fundamental issue for us in Indo-Pacific is how we're going to manage the relationship with the United States. And as there's no easy answer to that, we can pursue some of our independent ideas. But how far we are able to get offside from the American friends is a key question. And I think there's exactly where the debate between what some of us see in the public between Madame Joly and her conception of an inclusive Indo-Pacific and Ms. Freeland, who uses a different frame, that tension is going to be with us. And until we, until the cabinet can reach not a national consensus, but a working arrangement on where to go forward. Indo-Pacific will be everything and nothing.
I think what we should do in the immediate future is tone down the fear of missing out. So I don't see much to do about AUKUS personally when it comes to Canada's engagement in the region. I don't think it is a problem that we weren't invited to that particular mechanism. I think when it comes to things like, a revival of the Quad 2.0, a wait-and-see approach is probably best. And I do think keeping our energies focused on what we've been doing, which is, focus on, developing, reaching the status of strategic partner with ASEAN, and also focusing on our energies on the East Asia Summit, possibly the ADMM Plus down the road, because these are platforms where if there is a possibility to draw somewhat of a connection between these spheres or groups of friends, this is where it's going to happen, because this is where it has always happened. I think being able to secure invitations at Key Fora as opportunities to communicate our regional narrative around the Indo-Pacific. So if I'm right in being optimistic and this happens, then we should make sure that we do have a clear communication strategy behind that. And here the Shangri-La dialogue and its next iteration, I think, should be absolutely on our radar, and I hope that it is. I think the revival of our Canadian participation in multi-track engagements in the region is also vital. And that's sometimes the outcomes of these processes are hard to measure, are hard to quantify in immediate kind of practical terms. But I do think that, just having people like us, right, like as experts who are in a good position to take the regional temperature and develop these kind of networks and entry points to regional perspectives that can then feed back into more effective Indo-Pacific policy is actually vital. And this is something that we should consider very seriously. And finally, ASEAN will soon be announcing a regional action plan on women, peace, and security. I think that there is an opportunity for Canada to contribute, drawing from our expertise and added value in this particular domain. And being able to pay attention to what ASEAN comes up with in that regard, and where, on particular areas where we can offer an added value, will help also distinguishing us from other dialogue partners of ASEAN who are also active on the WPS front.
Jeff, quick final word, because we have a question and we're just over our time limit.
Right. So it's an Indo-Pacific strategy. We've accepted that that's now the framework, right? So within that limitation, and I think there's three things that we can do immediately. One is de-emphasize the relationship with like-minded states, talk more about inclusivity, talk more about broader engagement, de-emphasize partnership with the global West, looked for opportunities to do what I would call kind of omnidirectional diplomacy. Throw as much diplomacy out there as you can, engage wherever you can, and see what works, see what doesn't work, reevaluate as you're doing it. It's fixing the airplane as it's flying, but ultimately looking at the institutions that are in the region and trying to understand how Canada can bring value to them and how they strengthen Canada's position in the region. And that's also just kind of closely aligned with the idea of strategic integration, right? Make yourself at every table. Get invitations to institutions. Just be there and be part of the discussion in whatever capacity makes sense. And I think Paul Topol raised this idea of going into those fora humbly, right? And as a partner that's looking to contribute to solutions made in the region. Because that's really important. And I think, fundamentally, all of these institutions, ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus 6, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, if there is a such thing as a rules-based order, that's what that is. It's institutions, it's norms, it's rules, it's relationships, it's the linkages that are formed between organizational integration. So if we want to strengthen the rules-based order in Asia, first of all, we have to look at the indigenous institutions, because those are the ones that reflect regional values and priorities.
lest Mr. Topple interpret this as the fact that none of you, except for Women, Peace and Security, volunteered that we need to spend money. This is all.
Oh, yeah, that was my last point.
Yeah, this is,
Invest in regional-
this is all premised on
obvious.
on a robust development assistance agenda that Paul already described. In light of the time, we're going to take all three questions and comments at once so that we can have one round of responses. And of course, I'll leave to your individual judgment whether you want to pass. You don't have any obligation that each of you has to answer each of the three questions, comments, or observations. Please.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on something that Paul said, and I agree with what you said also about the third and fourth C's in the so-called 4C thing. I agree with an approach of red light, green light, yellow light to cooperation with China. The question is, what's the green light? I mean, I'll give you two concrete examples where it seems to be impossible to define a green light, and will we be able as Canadians to say, this is a green light, to Washington, this is a green light, we're supposed to be able to cooperate here, you can't say, we yield to you. Green energy. Under the terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, we get an exemption for vehicle assembly in Canada for electric cars, but we cannot use Chinese battery technology where they are leaders. Okay, that's green energy. Take another one.
Climate.
You say maybe agriculture, that's an area. We like food. Food's good for everybody. Genetics, we're supposed to cooperate on energy, but we can't cooperate on genetics, seed technology. So the question is, will there be a green light strategy for any area of technology in which we can cooperate independently of a say-so from Washington?
Thank you. We'll take Jennifer, and then Alina gets the final question. Keep it short.
So Jennifer Irish, just a question about the very last observations about partners. One in response to Paul Evans' comments about being hand in hand with the Americans. I get that we're hand in hand with the American interests. What if the Americans themselves regard that Canada has a different toolbox to offer, and that we could then offer something different in terms of our engagement with Asia Pacific? In other words, we don't have to be necessarily like them. The second very quick observation on that was I found it interesting that no one on the panel mentioned India as a partner. And part of the rationale of the Quad was to triangulate partners with, Australia and South Asia, and then you have Japan in the North Pacific, and then India. But no one raised that, although we've talked a lot about democracy, and India is the largest democracy in the world.
Thank you. And Elena, please.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about the role of people in any Indo-Pacific strategy, because I love the suggestion to reorient Canada's foreign policy to some aspects of what's going on in ASEAN. And as you know very well, all of you, ASEAN is supposed to be people-centered, people-oriented, but we often forget that. And this brings me somewhat to Paul's point about technology, because we often think of technology in terms of private industries, in terms of the state. But when we think more laterally about some of the governance frameworks surrounding data that are emerging right now, we don't often hear very much about Indigenous data governance movements, for example. And some of that is taking place in Canada itself. And it goes to the point about humility and thinking more broadly about how we frame some of the thinking around emerging tech and how that can make a real difference to the lives of many who have been left marginalized. Thanks.
Thank you. A rich array of questions. You're under great pressure to be as succinct as possible to allow the last panel to meet its timely schedule. So, Stéphanie.
I'm going to take up Elena's question. Thank you so much. So I think when it comes to the people-centered aspects of ASEAN, what I am personally focusing on more is kind of the, let's call it human security aspect, although obviously, I don't want to get into the semantics here, but so that connects very well, I think, with the point I raised about the imminent WPS regional action plan. And I think this is a good example of the kind of Canadian engagement that can happen in terms of the people-to-people relationships in a way that extends beyond the usual suspects, beyond us as experts, beyond retired officials, and reaches into other more kind of grassroots actors when it comes to our definition of civil society. And I think on these kind of, at the intersection of security and development, there are a lot of opportunities for Canadian engagement in multi-track, but really multi-track, right? Multi-track processes and developments that bring in, for instance, peace mediators in the region. There is such a great, really well-networked regional community of peace mediators and peace builders that are often very interested in participating in these processes, in reaching out to track one actors, including ASEAN, but others as well. And here I think Canada can kind of foster more and create more space for these relationships and these exchanges to actually happen, because in my experience, they've been quite productive.
Jeff?
So on the people-to-people exchanges, I think this is critical, and I think that's where the investment needs to come in terms of putting money behind initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. There's just clear need for Canada to be there more often, and for my foundation, we're working on that as a Canada and Asia conference to try to bring together alumni, to try to bring together the business community, to have discussions about what are Canadian interests in the region, how do we establish networks, how do we build on those networks. Those are the kind of activities I think are critical to maintaining or establishing people-to-people ties, but then the important part is also maintaining them, having a greater regional presence within the country embassies, establish deeper on-the-ground knowledge of what's going on, raise Asian literacy across the region so that Canadians can be more effective in using local languages, establishing local ties, building on those kind of things. It's about presence, it's about sustainability, it's about continued engagement, and that does unfortunately come with a price tag, but that's money really well spent, because that's where the foundation of the relationships are going to be built. The last point I'd make is on the cooperation side. I think it's really going to be very difficult, and I think one of the scary things about this recent national security strategy that came out of Washington, D.C. was how much the non-traditional security aspect of engagement had been securitized. And we saw, for example, when after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the immediate Chinese response was to shut down dialogue around climate change and around transnational crime. So we're seeing, unfortunately, those areas that used to be ripe for cooperation now becoming part of the security idea and response from both sides in terms of how to deal on hard security issues. So another potential challenge going forward.
And another potential panel or conference on economic coercion, which has attracted a coalition of states from around the world to battle that. Paul, final.
Well, I really like the question about a toolbox and a division of labor with our American friends. So occasionally an issue does come up where that actually works well, and it did certainly in the early 1990s when we moved ahead with a cooperative security agenda where they told us to push, and they would follow along when it was in their interest. So there are those moments that are magical. But I wanted to end it on a slightly different note. Our panel here was about Indo-Pacific, correct? This is the phrase we've been battling around with. Do I get a feeling that this meeting is organized by the Institute for Diplomacy, Peace and Diplomacy? Am I getting a sense that the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada is contemplating or would contemplate under part of a new Indo-Pacific strategy as renaming itself the Indo-Pacific Foundation of Canada? Is there a hint of this in the background?
Jeff can answer.
The simple answer is that would be against the law, because the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada was created in 1984 by an act of Parliament called the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada Act. It's within the purview of Parliament and the government in its interaction with Parliament to propose any changes to the act, which could include a name change.
So
But
let's see
at
if
the
the
moment,
strategy recommends that.
It's not a
Yeah,
guideline, it's the law.
for now. And we didn't quite answer Jennifer's question in detail, but Paul Topple did refer to one example in defense and security where, for example, we may not have that many additional ships to send into the region for some years to come, but we're awfully good at signals intelligence, at cyber, and so on. That's a division of labor. That's a comparative advantage. We're leaders among the allies. So I think among the other examples that Paul cited, that's there.
That's a good one.
And in light of the last question from Jennifer, your observations, Jeff, even if it's not under the title of the organization, there seems to be an appetite to have a more rich discussion and consideration of India and of South Asia in this context and in this agenda. So I leave that for future consideration. Join me in thanking the very erudite and articulate panel. I hope you benefit as much as I did. Thank you so much.